Royal Guard saves pregnant woman from a ruthless bully. And what happens next is unbelievable. Like, share, and comment below where you're watching from. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace, where James Harrison stood motionless at his post, as he had done for the past 15 years. His scarlet uniform gleamed in the early light, the brass buttons reflecting tiny mirrors of sunlight across the gathering crowd of tourists. Not once in those 15 years had he moved a muscle during his duty. Not when children waved frantically in his face. Not when drunk tourists tried to provoke him. Not even when a pigeon once landed on his bearskin cap and refused to move for 20 minutes. The tourists always tried to make him break. They would wave, dance, make faces, tell jokes, anything to get a reaction. But James remained as still as the stone walls of the palace behind him, his eyes fixed forward in an eternal gaze. His fellow guards often joked that he was more statue than man, a living embodiment of the unwavering discipline that had protected the crown for centuries. That morning started like any other. The usual crowd of tourists gathered, their phones held high as they snapped photos and recorded videos, hoping to catch even the slightest twitch of movement. A young boy in a Spider-Man t-shirt stuck out his tongue and crossed his eyes, while his mother laughed and took pictures. A group of teenagers tried to dance in front of him, their TikTok dreams of making the guard smile falling flat against his stone-faced expression. But there was something different in the air that day. Something that made the hairs on the back of James's neck stand up, though his face betrayed nothing. 15 years of military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that this day would be unlike any other. The crowd shifted and swelled as more tourists arrived, their excited chatter filling the air like buzzing bees. Through the gaps between people, James caught glimpses of a woman making her way slowly through the crowd. Even with his trained discipline, he couldn't help but notice how heavily pregnant she was, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly, while the other struggled with several shopping bags. Her face was flushed with exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept well. She wore a simple blue maternity dress that fluttered in the morning breeze, and her brown hair was pulled back in a messy bun. Something about her vulnerability amidst the pushy crowd of tourists made James's fingers tighten imperceptibly around his rifle. The woman, Sophia, as he would later learn, made her way to a spot near his post, leaning against the metal barriers with visible relief. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking deep breaths, and James noticed a slight grimace cross her face. In his peripheral vision, he could see several tourists glance her way, their expressions a mix of concern and hesitation. But none stepped forward to offer help. The morning sun climbed higher, and the crowd grew thicker. The air became heavy with the kind of tension that precedes a storm. James had spent enough time at his post to recognize the subtle shifts in energy that signaled trouble brewing. His muscles tensed beneath his uniform, though his expression remained impassive. Through the crowd, a new figure appeared. A man pushed his way through the tourists, his movements aggressive and entitled. He wore expensive clothes that somehow managed to look cheap on his frame, and his face wore the kind of sneer that James had seen countless times on bullies and troublemakers. The man's eyes darted around the crowd, looking for something, or someone, to provoke. James watched through his unflinching gaze as the man drew closer to his post, closer to where Sophia stood resting. The tourist chatter seemed to dim, as if the crowd could sense the approaching confrontation. A child stopped mid-laugh, clutching her mother's hand. An elderly man with a camera lowered it slowly, his jovial expression fading. The air grew thick with anticipation. James's training screamed at him to remain still, to maintain the dignity and discipline that had been drilled into him for over a decade. But something else, something deeper, whispered that today might be the day when duty and humanity would collide. Little did anyone know that in the next few moments a royal guard would do something that had never been done before in the history of the monarchy, and the world would never be the same. The crowd parted like waves around Sophia as she shifted her weight, trying to find a more comfortable position against the barrier. Her shopping bags rustled at her feet, filled with tiny onesies and soft blankets she had just bought for her baby. She hadn't meant to do so much shopping, but with only 6 weeks left until her due date, the nesting instinct had taken over. Now, though, she regretted not listening to her husband when he offered to come along. A sharp kick from the baby made her wince and rub her belly gently. "Settle down, little one," she whispered, smiling despite her discomfort. The morning had started out so peacefully, the kind of crisp, clear London day that made everything seem possible. She had walked through the parks, enjoyed the flowers blooming in the royal gardens, and even treated herself to a warm cup of tea at a small cafe. But now, exhaustion was setting in, and the growing crowd around her made her feel increasingly claustrophobic. She glanced at the royal guard standing just a few feet away, finding an odd comfort in his steady presence. There was something reassuring about his stillness, like an anchor in the shifting sea of tourists. The man in the expensive suit was getting closer now. James could see him more clearly, the artificial tan that made his skin look orange, the gold watch that caught the light with every aggressive gesture, the way his lips curled into a sneer when people didn't move out of his way fast enough. He was talking loudly on his phone, his voice carrying over the crowd. "These bloody tourists are everywhere," he barked into his phone. "Can't even walk properly in my own city anymore. Hold on, some idiot's in my way again." He shoved past a young couple taking a selfie, nearly knocking their phone to the ground. Sophia saw him coming, but couldn't move quickly enough. Her shopping bags were tangled around her feet, and the barrier behind her left no room to step back. The man barreled forward, his shoulder clipping her arm hard enough to make her stumble. "Oh!" she gasped, one hand flying to her stomach protectively, while the other grabbed the barrier to steady herself. Her shopping bags toppled over, spilling their contents across the pavement. The man paused his phone call, turning to face her with an expression that made the nearby tourists fall silent. "Watch where you're standing," he snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. "I'm sorry," Sophia said automatically, though she had done nothing wrong. She started to bend down to pick up her scattered purchases, but her pregnant belly made it difficult. "Sorry," the man scoffed, ending his call and shoving his phone into his pocket. "You're blocking the whole bloody pathway. What are you even doing here in your condition? Should be at home, shouldn't you?" A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. An elderly woman took a half step forward, but stopped when the man shot her a glare. Even the children's excited chatter had died down, replaced by a tense silence. James remained motionless, but his trained eye caught every detail. He saw how Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she tried to gather her things. He noticed the way she kept one arm curved protectively around her belly. He observed the man's aggressive stance, the way he loomed over her with his shoulders squared, classic intimidation tactics that James had seen too many times before. "I just needed to rest for a moment," Sophia explained, her voice quiet but steady. She managed to pick up a small yellow onesie, decorated with tiny ducks. The sight of it seemed to enrage the man further. "Rest? This isn't a bloody park bench. This is Buckingham Palace." He gestured wildly at the building behind them. "Bad enough we have all these tourists clogging up the streets. Now we've got people using it as their personal resting spot." A baby's cry pierced the air somewhere in the crowd, making Sophia jump slightly. Her movement seemed to draw the man's attention back to her, his face reddening with inexplicable anger. Something dark flickered in his eyes, the look of someone who had been waiting for an excuse, any excuse, to unleash their fury on the world. James felt his jaw tighten imperceptibly. In 15 years, he had never moved during his duty. Not once. But as he watched the scene unfolding before him, a new tension began to build in his muscles. The kind of tension that preceded action. The kind of tension that came before a choice had to be made. The man took another step towards Sophia, and the crowd held its breath. Nobody could have predicted what would happen next, least of all James himself. "Look at this mess," the man sneered, deliberately kicking one of Sophia's fallen bags. A tiny pair of baby socks rolled across the pavement, coming to rest near James's polished boots. "You're making the whole place look like a charity shop." Sophia's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. She straightened up as much as her pregnant body would allow, one hand still protectively cradling her belly. "There's no need to be rude," she said, her voice wavering slightly but gaining strength. "I'll pick everything up and be on my way." But the man wasn't finished. Something had snapped inside him, as if all the frustrations of his day, of his life, had found their target in this vulnerable woman. He stepped even closer, invading her personal space, his expensive cologne mixing unpleasantly with the morning air. Rude, he laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound made several children in the crowd shrink back against their parents. "I'll tell you what's rude. It's rude to stand here taking up space, making everyone walk around you like you're some sort of special case." More phones were coming out now, their cameras pointed at the unfolding scene. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the rising tension. Some people whispered among themselves, others looked around nervously for palace security, but most just watched, frozen by that peculiar human instinct that makes us unable to look away from conflict. James could see it all without moving his head. His peripheral vision, honed by years of standing guard, caught every detail. He saw an elderly man in the crowd reaching for his phone, presumably to call for help. He noticed a young mother pulling her children back, her face tight with concern. He observed how the man's right hand was clenching and unclenching, a telltale sign that James recognized from his military training. The prelude to violence. Sophia tried to take a step back, but the barrier prevented her retreat. Her shopping bags crinkled under her feet as she shifted, and she wobbled slightly, trying to maintain her balance. The baby chose that moment to kick again, hard enough to make her gasp. The man mistook her gasp for fear, exactly what he wanted. His sneer widened into something ugly and triumphant. "What's wrong? Can't handle a bit of truth? You women think you can do whatever you want just because you're pregnant. Probably don't even know who the father is, do you?" A collective intake of breath from the crowd. Someone muttered, "Bloody hell." A teenage girl near the front started typing furiously on her phone, probably live tweeting the whole incident. The tension in the air was almost electric now. Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "My husband is a sergeant in the Royal Marines," she said, her voice stronger now, anger overtaking fear. "He's serving overseas right now, protecting people like you who don't deserve it." The man's face darkened dangerously. "Oh, playing the military wife card now, are we?" He reached out and grabbed one of her fallen bags, lifting it mockingly. "Let's see what's so important that you had to block everyone's way for it." James felt his trigger finger twitch, the first involuntary movement he'd made on duty in 15 years. The man was now between him and Sophia, his back half turned to James. From this angle, James could see the sweat beginning to bead on the man's neck, could smell the mixture of expensive cologne and cheap whiskey that suggested he'd started his mornings with liquid courage. "Please," Sophia said, reaching for her bag. "Those are for my baby." The man yanked the bag away from her reaching hand, causing her to stumble forward, her face contorted in pain as she caught herself, both hands going to her stomach. The crowd surged forward slightly, then pulled back, like waves uncertain whether to break. Your baby," the man mimicked in a high-pitched voice. "Well, let's give your baby a little shower, shall we?" He began to turn the bag upside down, baby clothes and supplies threatening to spill onto the dirty pavement. That's when it happened, the moment that would soon go viral across the globe, the instant that would change everything. James Harrison, the Royal Guard famous for never breaking protocol, made a decision that would echo through history. His finger moved on the trigger of his rifle. The sound of a boot scraping against pavement shattered the morning air. A sound so small, yet in that moment, it seemed to echo across the palace grounds like a thunderclap. The crowd fell completely silent. Phones stopped recording. Children stopped fidgeting. Even the birds seemed to pause their morning songs. The first step was the hardest. 15 years of training screaming at him to stop, to remain still, to maintain the sacred tradition that had been his life's purpose. But sometimes, a greater purpose calls. James's second step was easier, each boot striking the ground with military precision. The man didn't notice at first, too caught up in his own performance of cruelty. He had just started to tip the bag further, when something made him pause. Perhaps it was the sudden silence of the crowd, or maybe it was that ancient human instinct that tells us when a predator is approaching. James moved with the fluid grace of a soldier, each step measured and purposeful. His rifle remained in the proper position, his posture perfect, as if he were performing the most formal of military drills. But there was nothing ceremonial about the look in his eyes. The man sensed the movement behind him and started to turn, a mocking smile already forming on his lips. "Oh, look who's decided to join the..." The words died in his throat as he found himself staring up into the face of the Royal Guard. Up close, James was even more imposing. 6 feet 4 inches of trained military precision, the morning sun glinting off his brass buttons and the barrel of his rifle. But it wasn't his height that made the man take an involuntary step backward. It was his eyes, cold, hard, and filled with the kind of authority that comes from years of service to the crown. Step, Away. James's voice was quiet, yet it carried across the silent crowd with perfect clarity. Each word was clipped and precise, carrying the weight of command that needed no volume to be effective. The man's face went through a rapid series of changes: shock, fear, then a desperate attempt at bravado. "You can't. You're not supposed to move. You're just meant to stand there like a statue." His voice had risen an octave, the false confidence cracking. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another step forward, the movement so controlled it seemed almost mechanical. His eyes never left the man's face, and his rifle, though still held in the ceremonial position, somehow seemed more present than before. Sophia had pressed herself back against the barrier, one hand still protectively curved around her belly, the other gripping the metal rail for support. Her face showed a mix of relief and disbelief as she watched the scene unfold. "This is what you're breaking protocol for?" The man's voice was getting higher, more desperate. He gestured wildly at Sophia. "Some woman who can't even take care of her own things. Do you know who I am? I'll have your job for this." James spoke again, each word measured and clear. "You have exactly 5 seconds to step away from the lady." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The threat was in the stillness, in the way he held himself, in the years of military training evident in every line of his body. Phones were recording again now, hundreds of them, their lenses capturing every moment. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Oh my God, is this really happening?" A child asked, "Mummy, is the guard going to arrest the bad man?" The man looked around wildly, suddenly aware of all the cameras pointed at him, all the witnesses to his humiliation. His face flushed red, then purple, as he realized he had lost control of the situation. With a sudden movement, he flung Sophia's bag to the ground. "Fine. Take care of your precious pregnant woman, but you'll regret this. All of you." He took a step as if to leave, then suddenly spun back, his hand raised as if to point at Sophia, or perhaps do something worse. He never completed the movement. In one fluid motion, James shifted his rifle to his left hand and caught the man's wrist with his right. The grip wasn't violent. It didn't need to be. It was the same perfect controlled pressure that James had learned in his military training, designed to immobilize without injury. That, James said, his voice still eerily calm, was a very poor decision. The man's wrist twisted uselessly in James's grip, like a rabbit caught in a snare. All his previous bravado drained away, replaced by the dawning realization that he had severely miscalculated. The expensive watch he'd been so proud of now pressed uncomfortably into his flesh, marking time in what was quickly becoming the most humiliating moment of his life. "Let go of me," he demanded, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. "This is assault. I'll sue the palace. I'll go to the papers." Each threat came out higher and more desperate than the last. James remained unmoved, his grip neither tightening nor loosening. His military training had taught him exactly how much pressure to apply. Enough to control, not enough to harm. His eyes, however, held something that his training hadn't given him. Something that came from a deeper place, where duty met humanity. "The papers?" James's voice carried clearly across the now silent crowd. "Look around you, sir. I believe the papers are already here." He nodded slightly toward the forest of phones recording every moment. "Along with approximately 200 witnesses to your behavior toward a pregnant woman." The crowd had grown even larger now, drawn by the unprecedented sight of a royal guard in action. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view. Tourists who had come hoping for a typical photo opportunity were instead capturing what would soon become one of the most viral videos of the year. Sophia had managed to steady herself against the barrier, her breathing gradually returning to normal. The baby, as if sensing the drama was ending, had settled down. She watched the scene with a mixture of gratitude and amazement, one hand still resting protectively on her belly. "I didn't," the man started to say, then stopped as he noticed 2 uniformed police officers pushing their way through the crowd. Their arrival seemed to trigger something in him, a last, desperate attempt to salvage his dignity. "She was in my way. She was blocking public access. I have every right to—" "To what?" James interrupted, his voice taking on an edge that made the man flinch. "To harass a pregnant woman? To destroy her property? To make threatening gestures?" Each question was delivered with the precision of a military drill, striking home like verbal bullets. The police officers reached them, taking in the scene with professional efficiency. One of them, a seasoned sergeant with gray at his temples, recognized the unusual situation immediately. It wasn't every day you saw a royal guard actively involved in an incident. "Everything all right here?" the sergeant asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. James nodded almost imperceptibly. "This gentleman," he said, making the word sound anything but gentlemanly, "was just about to apologize to the lady for his behavior. Weren't you, sir?" The man looked between James and the police officers, reality finally crashing down around him. His expensive suit suddenly seemed to hang badly on his frame, his carefully styled hair falling out of place. The facade of power he'd built around himself was crumbling, revealing the small, angry man beneath. I'm sorry," he mumbled, not meeting Sophia's eyes. "A bit louder, if you please," James suggested. For the benefit of those recording, the man's face flushed an even deeper shade of red. "I'm sorry," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I was out of line. I apologize." The younger police officer had moved to check on Sophia, while his sergeant took out a notepad. "Would you like to press charges, ma'am?" the sergeant asked. "We have plenty of video evidence, and I'm sure the palace guard would be willing to make a statement." Sophia looked at the man, now deflated and ashamed, then at James, who still stood straight and dignified, despite having broken centuries of tradition. She took a deep breath, her hand moving in small circles over her belly, a gesture of self-comfort that many in the crowd recognized and empathized with. "No," she said finally. "No charges. I think he's learned his lesson." She paused, then added with a small smile, "Though I wouldn't mind if those videos went viral. Some people need to see what real strength looks like." A murmur of approval went through the crowd. Someone started clapping, and soon the applause spread like waves across the gathering. It wasn't just approval for Sophia's grace and forgiveness. It was recognition of something deeper, something that James's actions had demonstrated, that true duty sometimes means breaking the rules for what's right. The police led the man away, his previous swagger replaced by slumped shoulders and averted eyes. As he passed through the crowd, people pulled back, creating a path not out of respect, but instinctive distaste. His expensive shoes scuffed against the pavement, the sound a metaphor for his fallen pride. James waited until the man was completely out of sight before turning his attention to Sophia. His movement was still measured, still professional, but there was a gentleness to it now. Without a word, he bent down and began gathering her scattered belongings, each item handled with the same care he would show to the crown jewels themselves. The tiny yellow onesie with ducks, a package of soft cotton blankets, the small pair of socks that had rolled near his boots. Each item was carefully placed back in the bags, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy. The crowd watched in stunned silence, phones still recording, as one of the Queen's elite guards performed this simple act of kindness. "Thank you," Sophia said softly, watching as he retrieved a small stuffed bear from under the barrier. "Not just for this, but for—" She gestured vaguely at where the man had been, words failing to capture the magnitude of what had just happened. James straightened up, bags in hand. For the first time, he allowed himself to properly look at her. "No decent man could have stood by," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet authority, but now warmed with genuine concern. "Are you all right, ma'am?" "The baby?" Sophia nodded, running a hand over her belly. "We're both fine, just a bit shaken." She managed a small laugh. "Though I think this little one enjoyed the excitement. Been kicking up a storm." A hint of a smile touched James's lips, another break in protocol, but somehow this one felt even more significant than the first. Behind them, palace guards were already moving to control the growing crowd, setting up additional barriers, but no one tried to interfere with James or Sophia. "My husband," Sophia said, accepting her bags from James. "He's deployed right now, Royal Marines. He always tells me I'm strong enough to handle anything, but—" She paused, blinking back tears. "Sometimes it's hard, doing this alone." "You're not alone, ma'am," James replied, and though he had returned to his formal bearing, his words carried genuine warmth. "Your husband serves the crown, and so do we. That makes you family." The words rippled through the crowd, captured on hundreds of phones, soon to be shared millions of times across social media. In that moment, James had transformed from a viral sensation into something more, a symbol of what service really means. A palace official had appeared now, walking briskly toward them. His face was a mixture of concern and confusion, clearly uncertain how to handle this unprecedented situation. But before he could reach them, something unexpected happened. Sophia's phone rang. Her hands trembling slightly, she pulled it from her purse. Looking at the screen, her eyes widened. It's my husband, but he's not supposed to be able to call for another week." She answered the phone, putting it on speaker without really thinking about it. "Tom? Sophia?" A man's voice crackled through the speaker, thick with emotion. "Love, are you okay? They're showing the video here at base. It's already everywhere. That guard, I'm fine," Sophia said, tears flowing freely now. "We're both fine. The baby's fine. And the guard." She looked up at James, who remained at attention but was clearly listening. "He was amazing." "Mate," Tom's voice came through, now directed at James. "I don't know if you can hear me, but thank you. Thank you for protecting my family when I couldn't be there." James broke protocol one final time. Looking directly at the phone, he spoke with quiet conviction. "Always ready, always there." "Isn't that what we promised?" There was a pause on the other end, then a choked laugh. "Per mare, per terram," Tom replied, quoting the Royal Marines motto. Through the phone speaker, they could hear him fighting back tears. The palace official had reached them now, but even he seemed moved by the scene. He cleared his throat softly, clearly trying to figure out how to handle this situation with the appropriate mix of protocol and humanity. "Guardsman Harrison," the official said, his voice professional but not unkind. He was an older man, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. "I believe we need to discuss what's happened here." He turned to Sophia, adding gently, "Ma'am, if you're feeling up to it, we'd appreciate your statement as well." Through the phone, Tom's voice came again. "Soph, I've got to go, but I'll try to call again soon. Love you both." The connection ended, leaving a poignant silence in its wake. Sophia wiped her eyes, squeezing James's arm briefly in gratitude before turning to the official. "Of course, I'll tell you everything, though I think the whole world will see it soon enough." She gestured at the crowd, where hundreds of phones were still recording every moment. The official, who introduced himself as Mr. Edwards, deputy head of palace security, guided them toward a less public area. As they walked, James maintained his military bearing, but there was a new dimension to his posture now. He wasn't just a guard anymore. He had become something more in the eyes of the watching crowd. News vans were already pulling up outside the palace gates. Reporters rushed out, cameras at the ready, but palace security kept them at a respectful distance. The story was spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. In a quiet room inside the palace, Mr. Edwards sat down with James and Sophia. The room was elegant but comfortable, with plush chairs and warm lighting that helped ease the tension. On a nearby table, a palace aide had thoughtfully provided tea and water. "Now then," Mr. Edwards said, removing his glasses to clean them, a gesture that seemed to help him gather his thoughts. "In my 30 years of service, I've never seen anything quite like this. Guardsman Harrison, you do understand that you broke several centuries of protocol?" "Yes, sir," James replied, standing at attention despite being offered a seat. "I accept any consequences for my actions." Sophia started to protest, but Mr. Edwards held up a hand. "Please, let me finish." He replaced his glasses and looked directly at James. "You broke protocol, and in doing so, you may have given the palace its finest moment of the year." The statement hung in the air for a moment. James blinked, the only break in his composure. Sophia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "The palace switchboard is already overwhelmed with calls. The video has gone viral. It's being shared thousands of times per minute." Mr. Edwards allowed himself a small smile. "The public reaction is overwhelmingly positive. You've shown that behind the ceremony and tradition, there's still a heart beating in these old walls." He turned to Sophia. "Ma'am, how are you feeling? Do you need medical attention? We have doctors on staff." "I'm fine, really," Sophia assured him, though she gratefully accepted a glass of water. "The baby's settled down now. I think he was just expressing his opinion of that awful man." Speaking of whom, Mr. Edwards consulted a note on his desk. "The police have identified him. Apparently, he's made quite a name for himself with similar incidents in the past. Your video might finally put an end to that behavior." A young aide knocked and entered, handing Mr. Edwards a tablet. He scanned it quickly, his eyebrows rising. "Well, this is interesting. The Palace press office has just received requests for interviews from every major news network. And," he paused, scrolling further, "His Royal Highness has been informed of the incident." James stiffened slightly at this news, but Mr. Edwards' next words made him relax. "He sends his commendation, Guardsman Harrison." His exact words were, "Finally, someone who understands what protecting the public really means." Sophia's hand went to her mouth in surprise. James remained at attention, but those who looked closely might have noticed his chest swell slightly with pride. "So," Mr. Edwards continued, setting down the tablet, "here's what happens next. Officially, there will be a review of protocols and procedures. That's inevitable. Unofficially." He smiled again. "I believe there's a commendation in your future, Guardsman. The Palace hasn't had this kind of positive publicity in quite some time." As if to prove his point, the aide returned with another update. Social media was exploding with the story. Royal Guard hero was trending worldwide. The video had been shared millions of times in just the past hour. Comments were pouring in from around the globe, praising James's actions and celebrating this rare glimpse of humanity breaking through centuries-old tradition. "They're calling you the People's Guard," Mr. Edwards said, scanning the updates. "The public loves a story where duty meets compassion, and yours, Mrs." He paused, realizing he didn't have Sophia's full name. "Walker," she supplied. "Sophia Walker." "Mrs. Walker, your grace in handling the situation has not gone unnoticed either. The video of you declining to press charges, that moment of forgiveness, it's resonating with people deeply." Another knock at the door brought a palace medical officer who insisted on checking Sophia's blood pressure and making sure both she and the baby were truly all right. As the doctor worked, James finally allowed himself to sit, though his posture remained impeccable. "The thing is," Mr. Edwards continued, watching the doctor's examination with grandfatherly concern, "this incident has sparked something larger than just a viral moment. We're receiving messages from military families around the world. Your husband's unit isn't the only one sharing the video. It's spreading through bases globally." The doctor finished her examination with a satisfied nod. "Everything looks fine, Mrs. Walker, though I'd recommend taking it easy for the rest of the day. Perhaps some rest at home." "Actually," Mr. Edwards interjected, "if you're feeling up to it, there's someone who would like to meet you both." He glanced at his watch. "Her Royal Highness was quite moved by the video, and she's asked if you would join her for tea." Sophia's eyes widened, and even James's perfect composure wavered slightly. "The princess?" Sophia whispered, one hand automatically going to her hair, as if trying to make herself more presentable. "Indeed, she has a particular interest in military families, as you probably know, and she was especially touched by the connection between Guardsman Harrison's actions and your husband's service." Before either could respond, another aide burst in, slightly out of breath. "Sir, you need to see this." She handed over her phone, where a new video was playing. It showed military bases around the world, soldiers in different uniforms, different countries, all standing at attention and then breaking their stance in perfect unison, a symbolic gesture of solidarity with James's actions. "It's become a movement," the aide explained excitedly. "Breaking stance for humanity, they're calling it. Veterans groups are sharing stories of times when following their heart meant breaking protocol. It's going beyond anything we expected." Mr. Edwards watched the video, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "a single act of kindness can ripple out in ways we never imagine." He looked at James. "You didn't just protect one person today, Guardsman. You've reminded people everywhere what true service means." Sophia, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly gasped softly. Everyone turned to look at her in concern, but she was smiling, her hands on her belly. "The baby's kicking again," she explained, "but it's different this time, calmer, like he's dancing." She looked at James. Would you like to feel? After all, he's partly kicking because of you." For a moment, no one breathed. This was more than just breaking stance. This was breaking down the walls between ceremony and humanity completely. James looked at Mr. Edwards, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. With the same precision he brought to every movement, James stepped forward and carefully placed his hand where Sophia indicated. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, a strong kick, clear and purposeful. James's eyes widened slightly, and something remarkable happened. He smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Strong," he said softly, "like a proper Marine's child." The moment was captured by the young aide, who had unconsciously raised her phone. The photo would later become even more viral than the original video. The royal guard, still in full ceremonial uniform, smiling as he felt a baby kick, while the mother beamed up at him. It would be called The Human Touch, and would go on to win several photojournalism awards. A gentle knock at the door announced another palace official, this one carrying several garment bags. "Her Royal Highness will be ready to receive you in 30 minutes, she announced. "We've taken the liberty of bringing some fresh clothing options if you'd like to change." Sophia looked down at her rumpled maternity dress, now slightly dusty from the earlier confrontation. "That would be wonderful, thank you." She turned to James. "Will you be joining us as you are?" James glanced at Mr. Edwards, who shook his head. "We have a fresh uniform waiting. Can't have you meeting the princess with scuff marks on your boots, however honorably acquired." They were separated to change and freshen up. In a private chamber, as James changed into a pristine uniform, he could hear the crowd still gathered outside, their voices carried up through the windows, excited chatter, occasional cheers, the buzz of a moment in history being witnessed. In another room, as Sophia was helped into a lovely maternity dress in royal blue, her phone buzzed with another message from Tom. A photo of his entire unit gathered around a screen, showing the viral video, all standing at attention, all beaming with pride. The caption read, "My wife, my baby, protected by my brothers in arms. Semper Fi." When they reunited in the hallway, both looked transformed. James's fresh uniform gleamed, every button polished to perfection. Sophia glowed in the elegant dress, her hair styled simply but beautifully. But it was more than their appearances. There was a shared understanding between them now, a bond forged in that extraordinary moment outside. As they walked through the palace corridors, guided by Mr. Edwards, tourists on the public tours stopped and stared. Whispers followed them. "That's them. The guard and the lady from the video." Some people bowed or curtsied, not to protocol, but to something more meaningful, respect for a moment of pure humanity. They passed paintings of stern-faced monarchs and battle scenes, centuries of tradition staring down at them. But today, these weren't just decorations. They were witnesses to something new. Each portrait seemed to watch as tradition and compassion walked hand in hand through the halls. "Just through here," Mr. Edwards said, pausing before an ornate door. "Her Royal Highness is very informal in private settings, but of course the usual protocols apply." He turned to James. "Guardsman Harrison, I know you're familiar with royal etiquette, but given today's events, I feel compelled to ask, will you be able to maintain protocol during this meeting?" James stood straight, his voice firm but warm. "Sir, I only break protocol when duty demands it, and right now, my duty is to represent the guard with all proper respect and dignity." Mr. Edwards nodded, satisfied. Then, with a twinkle in his eye, he added, "Though I hear Her Royal Highness has quite a sense of humor about the whole thing. She was particularly impressed with your line about proper Marine's child." Sophia, who had been nervously smoothing her dress, looked up in surprise. "You mean she's seen everything, even the recent parts?" "My dear," Mr. Edwards chuckled, "the entire palace has been watching this unfold in real time. I don't think I've ever seen the staff so united in following a story. Even the corgis seem excited. They've been barking at all the commotion." He checked his watch one final time, then placed his hand on the door handle. "Ready?" he asked, looking at them both. James and Sophia exchanged glances, guard and civilian, protector and protected, now bound together by an extraordinary chain of events. They nodded in unison. The door opened to reveal a sunny sitting room, decorated in soft creams and golds. Through the tall windows, they could see the palace gardens, where crowds still gathered, their phones glinting in the afternoon light. And there, rising from a comfortable armchair, was Her Royal Highness. Protocol took over, the proper bows, curtsies, and formal greetings. But the princess quickly waved them to sit, her warm smile breaking through the formality like sunshine through clouds. "I simply had to meet you both," she said, gesturing to the tea service laid out before them. "Though I must say, Guardsman Harrison, You've given my husband's old regiment quite a talking point. They're all claiming you must have some special forces training to move that smoothly after standing still for so long. James accepted a cup of tea with perfect precision. Regular training, Your Royal Highness, though perhaps a bit of extra motivation today. The princess turned to Sophia. And how are you feeling, my dear? Both of you? She glanced meaningfully at Sophia's bump. Much better now, thank you, Your Royal Highness, though I think this little one is going to have quite a story to tell about his time in the palace. His? The princess's eyes lit up. You're having a boy? Sophia nodded, then added with a glance at James, a future Marine, apparently. The conversation flowed easily after that. The princess shared stories about her own children's active periods before birth, making Sophia laugh and even drawing chuckles from James. They discussed Tom's service, the challenges of military families, and the unexpected ways people come together to support each other. As they talked, something remarkable was happening outside. The video had reached military bases in every time zone. Following the example of the first bases, units everywhere were performing the Breaking Stance tribute. Photos and videos flooded social media. American Marines, Canadian forces, Australian soldiers, all breaking their formal stances in a global wave of solidarity. A palace aide slipped in quietly to show them on a tablet. The princess watched the videos with tears in her eyes. You see, she said softly, this is what the palace should be. Not just tradition and ceremony, but a beating heart in service to people. She turned to James. Your actions today will be studied in military academies, Guardsman Harrison. Not just the physical response, but the decision-making. The understanding that protecting people sometimes means breaking with tradition. Thank you, Your Royal Highness, James replied. Then, with a hint of his earlier smile, he added, though I hope they don't make it a regular occurrence. The tourists are difficult enough to handle as it is. The princess laughed outright at that. Oh, I think you've earned a reputation that will keep them in line. No one will want to misbehave near your post now. As their tea drew to a close, the princess had one final surprise. Mrs. Walker, we've arranged for a car to take you home, and Guardsman Harrison will be your escort, with a small detour. Detour? Sophia asked. To the hospital where your husband's unit is streaming from. We've arranged a video call with better quality than a mobile phone. I think you both deserve a proper conversation after all this. Sophia's hands flew to her mouth, tears welling up. James stood straighter, if that was possible, his eyes bright with emotion. And one more thing, the princess added, reaching for a small box on a side table. Guardsman Harrison, this isn't the formal presentation. That will come later. But I thought you should have this now. She opened the box to reveal a medal. Not one of the usual ceremonial ones, but something new. The design showed a figure breaking from attention to extend a helping hand. The Palace Medal for Humanitarian Action, she explained. You're its first recipient. We created it today, inspired by your actions. It will be awarded to service members who show exceptional courage in helping others, even when, especially when, it means breaking from standard procedure. As James accepted the medal with trembling hands, Sophia felt the baby kick again. This time, it felt like applause. Later that evening, as the sun set over London, James resumed his post. Same spot, same stance, same ceremonial uniform. But something had changed. The tourists who came to take photos didn't try to make him laugh or break his concentration. Instead, they stood respectfully, some offering small nods of acknowledgement. On his chest, the new medal caught the fading sunlight, and if visitors looked closely, they might notice something else, a tiny pair of baby socks tucked carefully into his pocket. A reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in standing still, but in knowing when to move. In the years that followed, the story would be told countless times. It would inspire books, documentaries, and countless social media posts. But perhaps its greatest legacy was in the quiet moments, when someone chose compassion over convention, humanity over hierarchy, love over laws. And somewhere in London, a little boy would grow up knowing that he had kicked a royal guard while still in his mother's womb, and that kick had helped change the world, one breaking stance at a time.